I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
Who is winning in Ukraine, and what will happen next? As the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine approaches on Friday, the picture looks very different to the first weeks of the war, when hundreds of Russian tanks poured over the border and airborne forces attempted to capture Hostomel airfield, outside Kyiv, as a springboard to take the capital. Here we look at the status of the conflict and what might happen next. Is Russia already conducting a new offensive? There have been contradictory assessments of Russia's ability to conduct a significant new offensive. Although senior Ukrainian officials have warned repeatedly since before Christmas that Russia was planning a big new effort this year, evidence of preparations for a push similar to that of February 2022, involving a large-scale armored attack, remains thin. Recent claims, sourced to NATO officials, that Russia was amassing aircraft, were also largely discounted by the UK's Ministry of Defence. And while Russia has greatly increased infantry numbers, some estimates suggest more than 300,000 troops are in Ukraine, there is no evidence of hundreds of tanks mustering in a region heavily surveilled by spy satellites. The NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, has pointed to increased Russian efforts in the east as evidence that a new offensive has begun, but others see it as a continuation of efforts that have been going on for months. Russian shelling is less intense than it was in the summer around Severodonetsk, when Moscow was expending 60,000 shells a day. Despite last year's mobilization, analysts such as Phillips O'Brien of St. Andrews University believe Russian capabilities are degraded by the war and that those expecting a rerun of the initial invasion last year are wrong. What has happened since February 24th is that Ukraine has got stronger and has acquired better systems and is about to get more, O'Brien says. The Russians have been getting weaker. They have more soldiers, but their equipment is worse, their soldiers are less well trained than they were, and their ammunition supplies are getting lower. O'Brien and others say there is little evidence Russia is any more capable of conducting complex combined arms operations, integrating air power, armor and other elements, than it was a year ago. What is going on in the east? One view of fighting in the east, the hottest sector in the conflict, is that increased Russian efforts around the city of Bakhmut amount to so-called shaping operations for a future offensive, perhaps in the spring. Another is that Russia fears a major new Ukrainian offensive and has increased the tempo of attacks, at an extremely high cost, to tie down Ukrainian forces. A third view is that Russia wants to capture Bakhmut before the 24th of February anniversary for propaganda purposes, rather than anything meaningful. There is probably a little truth in all these views. One caveat is that Russian efforts are not focused solely on Bakhmut but at points along the eastern front, from the border with Kharkiv region down to the occupied south, perhaps to probe for weakness. Michael Kaufman, the head of Russia studies at the Center for Naval Analyses, in Virginia, US, underlined this point on Twitter recently, tweeting, "The Russian offensive consists of about 5 to 6 axes of attack focused on the Donbass. Rather than a major push along one part of the front, it is instead a series of distributed battles running north-south from Luhansk to Bakhmut and southern Donetsk." At this stage, it doesn't seem that Russia has employed reserves, and is likely using those units to replace casualties, or perhaps waiting for a breakthrough to exploit. That said, there's not much evidence of a larger additional Russian force in the waiting. What is clear is that the current Russian efforts show the poor leadership, logistics and tactics that have been the hallmark of its operations over the past year, with high casualties for very modest territorial gain.